we are going to take a look at the MVC GridView and how to do editing in it. And the reason I wanted to show this special webinar is basically there's a lot of questions that come up about how to do editing in MVC, and I believe using our GridView gives you an advantage because it makes it a little bit easier. So let's take a look at the first scenario of how to do general editing in MVC. Now I'm going to assume a little bit in the sense that you have some knowledge of how the model view control pattern works. But if you don't, if you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat, in the questions form, and I'll get to them in a little bit. So the first thing is when you have a grid, and when you, let's say, want to click edit. So one of the first demos when we first released this grid was this grid view editing demo. And when we click edit to edit, let's say, this row, what happens is it takes us to a whole another view. So as you noticed here, what it took us to was another view called editing edit, and it passed in a parameter called product ID with a value of 2, and then this view went ahead and loaded these items. And then when we click update, what will happen is it's going to do a HTTP post back to our web server, back to the controller, and the controller will then save the data out. So let me see if I can make that a little bit more clear. So what's happening is the very first view is called editing partial. Now, if you're familiar with our grid view, we use partials because our grid views support callbacks, and traditionally in MVC you don't have callbacks, so it makes it very seamless. So what you essentially do is you put the grid into this state. Now, by the way, I'm going to first explain this route, and then I'm going to show you a much easier way with our MVC grid view. And I think it's important to appreciate what this can give you. So, and why maybe you want to use this. So here we have our grid view, and it sets up some common things like key field name, etc., etc. Well, let's say you want to then edit something out. Well, what we've done here is we've added our own custom columns, and one of the first columns we've added here with this pound sign is the command column. And what this command column has, it's got a special data item template where we define the actual links, and these are action links. One says edit, one says delete. And what we're doing there is basically defining that, hey, we've got a view that we're going to called editing edit, and this is the value we're going to pass into it. So we're going to take the current data item from this grid called product ID, which is its key field name, and pass it as a parameter. And so you can see that it's not a bad way. It allows you some flexibility because you can define what you want in the templates. So we've got editing, delete, we've got new, and then we've got the rest of the columns that we set up and some sorting options and so forth. So it's not a bad way to go because ultimately, you know, it gives us that view that we just saw. What happens though is then we actually have to make another view. So when we actually click edit, what ends up happening, let me make this a little bit larger, what ends up happening is then we get redirected to this page, which is the actual editing edit. And here, this is where we've defined a custom form that says, okay, well, I'm going to have a product name field, I'm going to have a text box, etc., etc. So you can see that we're individually setting up everything in the form, which is once again not a bad way to go because it gives you that flexibility. And for myself, like I said, if you've got that need, specific need that you need to do it, that's fine. But we're going to get to, I think, a solution that's much better. So let's first take a look at the controller here. Now, what happens in the controller, when we first load this view, by the way, let me point you guys to something real quick. If at all I'm going a little bit too fast or some of these concepts are not making sense, if you go to tv.devexpress.com, search for a video for MVC Grid.
Hey, Mahul.
Yes.
Mahul.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Your screen is frozen. Your screen is frozen.
Okay. So you will have to, everybody, I apologize, and I'll back up a little bit because it's Friday, and I apologize, so let's just back up a little bit, okay? I won't start completely from the beginning because I think you got the gist of what I was saying, but essentially what I was saying is when you have, we have this demo called GridView Editing, And what happens is when you click on this editing, it takes you to a whole nother view, as I explained. And what happens is on this view, it's nice looking and everything, but it's a custom form that you have to develop. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I just think there's a much easier and faster way to do this, and that's what I'm going to show today. So one of the things I wanted to explain, though, is what's happening in there. So specifically, we have, this is the editing partial. Now, you're used to this. This is what the grid view looks like in your partial page. You call DevExpress, HTML DevExpress GridView, set up some settings. But what we did particularly is, instead of just adding regular columns, we added a special command column where we added the edit, delete, and new links, and then define the view that we're going to redirect through on this link, as well as the parameter that we're passing. Now, like I said, that's all fine, but for myself, like I said, there's the easier way. Because one of the things you have to do, obviously, in that scenario is you then have to go and define the actual editing form, which is what we've got here. So this editing form says, hey, this is what my labels are going to look like, this is what my text box, comma box, etc., etc. And then this form still has to go back and you have to define where it's going to be posted to, etc., etc. So in this case, we're telling it, hey, we're going to do a form method post, an HTTP post, using this data like product ID and so forth that the user updates and send it back to our controller. So let's take a quick look at the controller, and we'll just see here though. So what's actually happening is when we first hit the grid, we're getting the data, right? So here's the editing page, and the editing page eventually calls the editing partial page, and in both cases we're just getting the editable products from a common controller. Now, I will explain why this says demo view and why we have this thing called Northwind Data Provider, because there's some good practices in MVC. And in fact, one of the things we like to do is make sure that you have the full features in MVC that you get, because we have, I think, the best library for MVC. But it's also important to stay within that paradigm to make sure you've got separation of concerns and all that goodness. So what's happening here is we initially get the list of editable products, and that's loaded up inside of the form. And so the very first time we click on edit, what happens is it takes us to a partial view called editing edit. And here, the very first time it just gets the values, which is why we're doing an HTTP get, right? And then what we're doing is when they actually save the data, it's actually calling this method for the post. And this is where this little method comes in handy, the model binder. And the model binder gets those items that are on that form and binds them using this type called DevExpress editor binders back to our original model, so that we can essentially then pass it into a method called update product. And I'll show you update product in a minute. Well, in this essence, you won't see the same update code as you probably have, mainly because our online demos, we don't actually save the data out, but you'll see in just a minute. So when I talked about good practices, this is one of the good practices. So for example, let me back up here. This model and this controller have a separation of concern. The controller's job is to take care of delivering to the view. Delivering data to the view, but not necessarily talking to the database. Well, essentially, our model can be that sort of in between. So the model represents the data, and we can also use the model to take care of creating the context for the database, as well as setting up update, delete methods, and all that good stuff. So here you can see we've got all sorts of method for, well, the first thing is we generate general data context, and then we can reuse that. So we've got this thing called DB, which, as you can see, we reuse. So if we wanted to get the categories, we'll write a little link here that says return from category in this categories table, and just get all the columns for category. And we do this again and again. And essentially, let me show you the update product. Okay, so let's take a look at delete product, right? Or you can even take a look at the update product. But the idea here is that essentially this is where you write the code. And this, now I won't focus too much on this today. I want to show a little bit in essence, but this model part is always going to be essentially the same, because you have a model that defines what your backend looks like, and you know essentially that you have to wire up this capability that says, okay, I'm going to save this data back to from my grid. I'm going to grab that data and then save it back, give it to the model, and the model is then going to write it out to whether it's linked to SQL or XML, or let's just say you've got Oracle or something else, right? So in essence, these are the methods you'll have to define in any case, whether you use our grid or not. Now, as I mentioned, that is all fine and good, but we've had this feature in our ASP.NET MVC grid, actually in our web forms grid, that makes it a lot easier. And I'm going to show you why. The first reason is, and the biggest thing was, a lot of people had kept asking us that, hey, this editing, it's all fine and dandy, but I don't want a form. I want to edit in the grid. So we've heard you, and what we did in the last release was we added inline editing. Now, you may say, first of all, why are you showing a form instead of actual inline editing? And the reason is because this form, I think, is very useful. The very first thing to realize about this form is you do not generate this form. We actually generate this form for you, and we've got a little special algorithm that figures out how to do this, how to do the layout of this form. So, for example, basically, this all the editable columns are automatically placed into its appropriate editor. So, for example, this units in stock gets a spin edit. For unit price, it gets a spin edit that can change in different ways. So, and the combo box automatically gets a drop down. So, as you can see, this is a very useful little way for you to generate a beautiful edit form without actually programming it yourself. The grid automatically looks at the model and says, oh, this is what I need to generate. Now, let's take a look at the code for this, and then we can see how that's being done. And then I'll show you how to actually wire this up in a little demo yourself. So the first thing is, we see that we have an inline editing partial, but we don't have a form. And that's because the grid view generates all that. So if we take a look at, our editing here, all we're defining in here is we are enabling a command column. We're actually we're not creating a command column, we're actually just setting it to true. And then the only thing we have to do is, because this is MVC, just like we have to do for the callback route values, we have to define route values using callbacks on how the data will be updated or deleted or inserted. And so it's actually quite easy. So let's see how we can do that. Now, as always, I like to start from a base default MVC project, and let's go to Visual Studio. I'll say File, New Project. Now, as I've mentioned before, if you've got an existing MVC application, MVC 2 or 3, and you want to add DevExpress to that, what I recommend is go to devexpress.com/MVC. Now, this isn't the local demo, but the MVC, this local demo is the exact duplicate of the online one. And you'll see at the bottom links on what references you need to add to your current MVC project to be able to use DevExpress. So there's some script references, style sheet references, as well as assemblies that you need to add. Now, if you don't want to do all that, what I recommend is just start a new DevExpress MVC application. And there's actually a way through NuGet as well that I can show you a little bit later on. If you're interested, let me know in the questions, and I can show you sort of the NuGet approach to do this. So what I like to do is I like to use our project template. So we've defined several project templates. Now, you may be looking at this 11.2, and unfortunately, we're still not at code freeze, so don't get too excited. While I got it installed, it's not very stable, but it's something that it's getting there, though. We're close. So I'm going to use the DevExpress ASP.NET MVC3 Web Application 11.1 using the Razor View Engine, because I just think the Razor View Engine is very nice. And we'll call it DX MVC Edit or something like that. And what will happen is this will create a blank project that allows us to start editing. Now, for myself, I like to move this projects over here, and if you just somehow my Visual Studio got reset here, so let me move this over back here. All right. of course, as developers, you know, it's very important to get our Visual Studio just right. So, anyways, what I've got now, I don't really need the toolbox here in MVC because MVC doesn't have design view, and you know, you don't really need it. MVC lets you get right at the core of the stuff. So, the first thing I want to do is I'm going to get rid of this viewback message. I don't really need that, and then I'm going to hang on one second. The first thing I want to do is I want to have some data I can reference. Now, I tend to use the standard Northwind file. You can use anything that you prefer, and let's say you have SQL Server or so forth. So what I'll do, I'll just go add existing item and add it to the app data folder. And to get at it, we provide all the demos for free, so you can use this if you'd like as well. So if you go to your C drive, I've got a shortcut too, but let me show you how to get to. Go to C, Users, Public, and our public documents, and this is where we keep our demos now. I think starting since about a year ago because of IIS Express or something. So if you, I'll go to 2011.1 components, ASP.NET, MVC, C#, MVC. By the way, we have all the demos for Razor and the Web Forms View Engine for MVC are all installed locally. So under Razor, I'll go to App Data, and I'll grab the northwind.md. No, I actually want the MDB file. So the MDF is the IIS Express version, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that I'll stick with the MDB version. So let's go App Data, oops, northwind.mdb. And so now we have the data that we'll get at. Now, after we have the data, what we want to do is now at this point, what you can do in your model is create, you can go add new item, and you can go to data and create a link to SQL class. And if you're not familiar with that, essentially what that'll do is, well, let's just see, you can call it something like Northwind, and this will bring up the designer. And so now we can go through our app data, double click on that, and that'll open it up in Server Explorer. Actually, it'll open up a double click on so open access, but this now points to our local version of the Northwind MDB. I can pull in these tables that I need. I'll just select, you know, I really just need employees, but I'll bring them in all so you can see how it supports those. Oh, that's right. Okay, so let me back up a little bit. Yes, link to SQL will have a problem with access. So it's for this demo, what I'll need to do is use the local version of the MDF. So let's do this. Let's bring in the MDF as well. So that'll pull it in as a SQL Express file, and that'll make it easier to pull in from link to SQL. So right-click, add existing item, public documents, 2011.1, and let's grab app data, northwind.mdf, and I'll grab the log file as well. And now I can double-click on this, and let's see, we can add a new model again. And oops, what I want to do is open this, go to tables, and let's say I really just want employees. So let me, you know what, I'll grab the entire table just because it's got a list of, it's got its own connections and so forth that it wants to maintain, so hierarchies and stuff. So if there's any dependencies, that'll be pulled in as well. Now, I mentioned that it's good practice to keep data out of your controller. So for example, in here, I know in this view, I have to pass in some model, right? So I can do something like, you know, create a DataContext and do get. That's not the best way to go about it, because now we're putting the concern to the controller. So as I mentioned, we want to put that into more in sort of the models area. So what I'm going to do, actually, you'll have to forgive me, I'll cheat a little bit, but just to save some time, what I'll do is I'll pull in the same, I believe it's under models, and northwind.cs. Now, you can call this anything you'd like. Do you want to replace it? No. So what we did was, essentially, I've got a file here, and this file essentially defines the thing. Now, the first thing is, in doing something like this where you're cheating a little bit, is make sure the namespaces are correct. So this will be called DXMVC Editing, for the same name as our project. Okay. Okay. And then we want to rename this as well. So we're referencing the right DXMVC editing. And so now it can recognize that this Northwind data provider and this data context key are referring to the appropriate model that we've got in here. And what's great about this is essentially, so let me back up a little bit and explain what we've got in here. So what we've got essentially is, we know that every time we want to touch data, we're going to need a data context to our model. And that's what we've got here. So this method, and you see that most of these methods are static. That's because we want to be able to call them again and again without having to create, for example, this class for the data provider. So we can just, a static class, as you know, allows us to say simply the name of the class dot whatever method we want to call on it. So we can say northwind.dataprovider.db, and as it's public, it'll let us get at db, and then we can do db dot something else, or we can use one of the more convenient methods like get categories, which what it will do is, since we know we got to have to create that context, and since the data context itself is static, it will go and say, listen, let's first check and see, using this key called db Northwind data context, if it exists, and if it doesn't, create it, right, and then return that. And so this is a way to do what's called a singleton pattern. And so this provides us always at least one data context that exists, which is a fantastic way to maintain, since you don't want to create a whole bunch of data contexts. You just want to be able to use it and hand it off as necessary. And so, and being .NET, once it goes out of scope, it will free it up. So what's great about this is, now in these other methods, like let's say get categories, we can simply say DB, and when we do DB, it hits this method and says, hey, is there a data context? No. But as you notice, we're not going new.data context, et cetera. This is a really clean way to just say db dot, and then we can access the categories, because the db returns the data context, which points to our Northwind data file. So let's take a look at that. So this lets us get access to this class, Northwind data context. But like I said, I don't want to dwell too much into this, but you get the general concept. This represents our model so that it has items for, let's say, categories. And so this, for example, let's back up. Categories here points to a system linked data table, which actually gets the table from the category type. So you get the general gist of it. But this is kind of the approach you want to think about when you're separating concerns in MVC. So now I have sort of the model. I've sort of got the data layer defined that says, hey, I have my get methods, and I've also got my update methods. And so what I want to do, actually, let's see if I can collapse this. Okay, so by the way, I just did a right-click there, and I did collapse through definition, so it makes it a little bit easier to see. But as you can see, I've got my get methods, and I've got my insert, update, delete methods, and all the goodness. And I've got this other thing here called editable product, and this is a really slick way to set up your model as well, because here, as you can see, we've got some things defined on the model. And this makes it easier because the grid can do model validation. So it will take this attribute of this property for product name and says, hey, this is a required field. And if I don't get it, this is the error message I want you to show. And so, and also here's another requirement, that it has to be at least 50 characters long. And if it's not, let them know this. So it's a very slick way to set it up in your model and just have the grid automatically pick up on that. So now we've got that defined. So let's go and define our grid. So the first thing is we got to go to our view. So here's our index page, and you know, let's dump all this. And the first thing you want to define is the actual view. So hang on one second. Well, before I define, what I'm going to do in here is I'm not going to define the grid in here because I need it to be a partial page, and this is our default page. So let's first go and define our partial. So I'll right-click on Home, I'll click Add, and I'll select View, and here I'll call this Editing Partial. And I'll make sure I click Create as Partial View. Now, I'm not going to collect strongly typed view, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Is because I've defined not in here, I've defined inside our Northwind file here, the type of methods I'm returning are IEnumerable. Now, we could have just as easily sent the actual type of the table, as you noticed in this file. I can go and here, let's collapse this as well. I can just as easily said, you know what, I'm just gonna return customers because it knows what that customer type is. But that's up to you. So for us, you know, the grid can bind to anything that has an IEnumerable interface, and both of those, the link version and this version, has that as well. So as I said, just for our demo purposes, we've done this, but it's fully compatible with just about any IEnumerable interface, or I believe iList is supported as well. Okay, so let's go back to our editing partial. And so the first thing we're going to do is, it's very common, as you've probably seen in many of these demos now, is you want to define the grid. So here, I'm going to say html.devexpress.gridView, and we're going to pass in some settings. And this is essentially some fluent HTML here. And this says that we are now going to use the settings to set it up. So I'm just going to quickly type a few of these, and then just to kind of show you that, you know, what the base ones are necessary. So you absolutely need a name, and then one of the key things in any editing scenario is you're going to need to set the key field name. This is the field that is necessary for editing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit the categories table. So I'm going to need the category ID. Now, I do know that's the column, but if you're not sure what the column is, you can always go to your model. I believe you can go to this DBML file. Okay, so sometimes they define it, sometimes it's not defined, but in here, this category ID for us is the field, and if not, you can always go down to, let's go to definition, and here, you know, for us, we know that this is the field that you can further define your model and say, yes, this is my actual, how do I say, a key field. So in here, we have to let the grid know what that key field is that's unique to use as the value. And of course, with our grids, because we're using callbacks, you should absolutely define the callback route values. Otherwise, the grid just will not work. And the reason is the grid needs to know how to call back to the controller to do paging and so forth. And the way it does that is through this controller definition of callback route values. So I'm going to set it to home, and the action that it's going to take for a callback, the action method it's going to call, we haven't defined it yet, but it'll be called editing partial. So let's copy this and define this. Now, I think we have the base of what we need, so let's go and define that. So, well, before we define the editing partial, let's figure out which fields we're going to show. Now, usually I like to set the grid view's width up to something like 100 pixels, something like that. So I just set it to system.web. Oops. .ui. I believe it's web controls. Unit. Now, I'm sorry if it seems a little unusual, but this is one of the ways to set it up, right? So unless you have a direct reference to system.webui.controls, which I don't like to add just for the unit.percentage, you can just simply reference it and say this is the percentage value that it gets pointed into the with. And then let's set up the columns we want to show. Now the categories table doesn't really have much to show. So let's take a look at our Server Explorer again. Let's see what's in categories. So in categories, we've got ID, name, description, and picture. So let's just take a look, and we'll show the first 3 columns there, ID, name, and picture. And to do that, we're going to say settings dot columns dot add, and this is going to be category ID, and I'll do the same for, oops. And I'll do the same for category name and description. So, and finally, we're going to need to call the bind method, where we're going to pass in our model, which we haven't passed in yet, but we'll do that in just a minute. And then we'll say get HTML. And so now, essentially, we have a basic grid. Now, if I ran this right now, you won't see anything. And that's because we haven't passed in a model. So the first thing is, I want to pass in a model here. And so you might be wondering, well, what are you going to pass in there? Well, what you want to pass in is the base default model that is necessary. And in our case, this will be the IEnumerable type that we had defined earlier. So let's first define that up here. And this will be so we're going to say model. Oops. And it's going to be IEnumerable. Now, in our case, IntelliSense will let us know that if it knows what IEnumerable is or not, if we've got the proper references. So we may need to add another reference to that. So in essence, we've told it that we are going to pass in a model, but our model specifically is going to be of IEnumerable type. Now, right away, it gives us these squiggly lines and says, IEnumerable what, right? Did you mean the system's collection generic type? And I did. So what I'm going to do is I can use the mouse over and I'll click this, or I can just hit Control period, and this will bring it as well. Now, CodeRush actually makes this a little bit easier. So if you're using CodeRush, there's some shortcuts in there as well. But at least now it knows that this model is referring to a model of IEnumerable type that will get passed in. So, but at this point, this is just a partial page. So what we need to do is we need to actually, on our base page, tell it that that's what we want to show. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say HTML dot call the partial method, because we're calling a partial page, and call editing partial. And once again, we need to pass in a model. So and this is the model that gets passed in, but right now the model isn't defined anywhere. So once again, we need to tell this page, the default page as well, as there is a model that's getting passed in, and it too is of type IEnumerable. Now, there's an important, and once again, this wants us to set it up as system collection. Now, by the way, if you don't want to avoid that system collection, I believe you can add it to references here, and that'll take care of it wanting to have the specific reference types. So at this point, I want to talk a little bit about, you might have heard of that pattern for model view, view model, and so forth. I believe it's popular in WPF. But the same concept applies to MVC in the sense that, yes, you've got the overall model view pattern, but when you are actually editing data, so for example, the example we looked at earlier, where we've got this grid, and when we're editing this data, we're editing one table here, the categories table, or the product, I think is an editable products table that we're editing here. What you want to do is you may not necessarily do what we're doing here in the demos, and we do this in the demos just to show you, but the good concept is usually that you'd create a subset of your base model, so that way it doesn't have access to all of the other items, because the concern for this view is only that model. So the idea is that you want to create a subset of that model, a view model, that can be accessed by that a particular controller in that particular view. So I haven't done it here, but it is definitely something you should consider, especially because it'll make it easier to figure out when you're editing, debugging, and it's also just another separation of concerns for MVC. So now we have defined our view. Now, if I ran this right now, let's just take a quick look at it. We won't actually have any data. Well, first we've got some errors. Let's figure out what those errors are. And so it does not recognize invoices. Okay, so our data context doesn't have invoices. So I believe I probably did not bring in that table. Let's go back and take a look at our Northwind MDB file. And it might be easier just to go to Server Explorer. Okay, so just in case, it may be a view. Yes, so what it's basically looking for are some of these views, and one of the views was invoices. So let me bring that in as well, and that way the data context will say, yes, that's what I was looking for. So let's rebuild it. All right, so now we've got a couple of errors and doesn't understand what an order is. Okay, I'm going to save everybody time, and let's just underneath this. And I'm going to let's cut this model for a second. So rather than chasing down all the tables and views that I didn't bring in, and I absolutely promise you that this is actually the same MDF that we used in the other one, but I'm just going to pull in the model from here just to make it a little bit easier. So this MDBL and Northwind actually points to the same exact MDF that I copied in here. So let me just pull that in, rather than you having to watch me figure out some weird debug errors. So let's recompile it. Oh, so the first thing is when we recompile is, once again, it has no idea. So what we want to do is change the actual namespaces, and I believe we may have to change it in Designer as well. Nope, it got updated. Excellent. All right, so in essence, it's as I mentioned, it's the same one as we had before, and I think it's Control-MO that collapses to definitions. And yeah, so we've got the same set of items, the views, the products, and maybe any stored procs that you may have to pull in and so forth. So as I mentioned, it all depends on what you are planning to use and link. But as I said, that's up to you. So now let's take a look at this in action. The first thing I'm going to do is let me go to this partial view, because here's a thing I learned. So let's say if I ran it from this page, what it does, it goes to this page, and I actually find this very annoying because, as you know, in MVC you've got routing. So what you want to do is you just want it to go to the base page where MVC's routing figures out where you need to end up. So this will redirect us to index and to an empty grid, which is what we essentially have. So what you want to do is to avoid all that, depending on whatever page you start on, is set a default start page. And to do that, I right-click on the project, go to Properties, and under Web, set it to a specific page, but leave it empty, and that will automatically direct it. So now I'll save this, hitting Control-S, and I'll get rid of it. Now, by the way, if you notice, one of the things I'm doing here is I try to minimize I got rid of all the toolbars, and I try to minimize all of the things that are open, so that way we can just have a nice, clean VS and just work on the code alone. So the first thing is I've noticed is I had an extra semicolon. Now that's because I added a semicolon after our call, and that's not necessary here after get.html, so let's remove that. And now we actually want to pass it some data. So what we're going to do is this default view first need to pass in some of that category table items that we had mentioned earlier. So what we want to do is call specifically that method. Now, what was that method? Well, we know, Control-MO, there's a get categories that gets exactly what I want, which is those columns in the get categories table. So let's go back to our controller, and we're going to say views, the view can take a couple of parameters. Now here I can actually have it show a different view altogether by passing in the name, but obviously in this case I just wanted to have index. And I believe we can simply pass in the object model. I tend to pass in that view just so that you know that that's the specific view that you wanted to show, but it's not necessary. As you can see, Control-Shift-Space, that there's a lot of overloads for this view controller.view method, which has a view result as an output. So at this point, what I can do is I can simply hit Control-Space and I'll do get categories, and it doesn't recognize it. Why is that? Well, the first reason is, well, let's do Control period here, and it says, listen, if this thing actually exists in DevExpress editing, but what it is because we need a reference to the model. So we want to add that we're going to be using the DevExpress editing models namespace, and so now we should be able to say, since get categories is a method, we should be able to say that this is, it still doesn't recognize it. Okay, so the first thing is let's first do a quick build, and now we should be able to reference get categories. Interesting. Okay, so let's just do a quick build and see. We may not have, we have our DevExpress editing, MVC models. It's a static class, Northwind data provider. Okay, so let's make sure that we can reference that Northwind data provider. So yes, so we can reference the Northwind data provider. And so if I do get categories this way, it should be just fine. So, interesting. Okay, so theoretically, for some reason it's wanting me to reference this, but in essence, we can call that, and because it's a static method, we don't actually need to generate that item. Now, if I run this right now, in fact, let me run it right now, and what you'll see is we'll get data right away on this default view as soon as it loads up, and that's fine, but there's a key piece missing from this, and I want to highlight this. Now, if I do something like this, I try to sort it, I got this weird error, and what's going on is it's trying to do a callback, and the way it does that callback, it's got the callback route values that says, hey, I need to know where to go to the server. So in this editing partial, it goes, where's the editing partial? So what we want to do is, I believe, MVC provides some methods to generate this stuff, but we can easily create it. So it's going to be a public action result, and it's going to be called editing partial. Now here, instead of passing in a view, it's going to be sending a partial view, but in essence, it's going to be passing the same thing. So this way, when I do sorting, paging, any operation that does callbacks, it's going to hit this method. And that's great. That's fine. Without dwelling too much into this, let me just show you real quick, because I understand. Well, let's put it this way. I don't want to get too long on time, but let's enable editing now, and that's what we really came to see in here, right? So now when we do this, sorting's all fine and dandy, and now to enable the editing button, what we're going to do is a few very simple things, right? And so watch this. This is sort of the good bits, right? In here, what I want to do is, I know I want a command column. Now, in our web forms version, you get this automatically. You say, editing or something like that. And what's great is the approach we took with MVC makes it just as easy for you to enable it using the code approach as well. So what you want to do here is, first, we want to figure out what button on it. So I want to enable editing here, right? So first thing I'm going to do is settings dot, and I'm going to say command column, and you can see I have access to it right away. So the first thing I want to say is settings command column visible is true. So right away I have the command column. Now, I'll copy this. Next thing I want to do is I want to figure out which button I want to show. So I want to be able to do editing. So I'm going to say I want to show the edit button, and I'm going to set its visible property to true as well. So now I have instantly enabled editing. Now, if you remember back from the other demo, you actually had to define the editing button yourself. And nothing wrong with that. If that's the approach you like to take, that's fantastic. I mean, you can still we can still have another command column we can add like this with our own custom action links, etc., etc. But you can see the benefit right away because all of that code goes right away, and I can easily get this edit button enabled. Now, key problem is right now, this edit button, when I click on it, what is it going to do? Can it use this callback route values? Well, not exactly, because what this edit button is doing is it's updating it. And so it has its own specific route values, and we should define those right now. So what we're going to do is going to say settings edit, and you'll notice that we've got extensive, nice little API there. And here we can see you got add, delete, edit, new, and the one we want is update. Update references the edit function. And at this place now, you can see it's very similar to the other item before, where it's just a route values, where it says, hey, when I take this action, this is the controller. Oops. This is the controller and the action that you should go to. So I'm going to put the controller in the home method, and I'm going to put the action to refer to a specific action that I want happening in there. And since this is editing, I kind of want it contextual you want to have your naming, in MVC, naming is kind of important, so you want to have it named as proper as possible. And in this case, this is the action editing update partial. So now we can close it off and close it. So now when I click edit, it knows that, hey, this is the update route values I'm going to take, and this is the method you're going to hit. Now, before I define that method, let's just take a quick look at this, what we've got in the grid so far. Now, when I click edit, I have an edit right away. I've got a form. Fantastic, right? Very nice. And problem is, when I click update, whoa, we've got big problems, right? And this is because I defined a route value, but I didn't actually define the action. So let's go and do that. So we've got our home controller. Now, typically, if you don't define something as HTTP GET, it's kind of implicit. But for a post method, you absolutely want to define it. And the reason you want to define it, first of all, this goes back to a little bit to the HTTP days, and this is where people say MVC is closer to the metal. What's happening here is that we are actually taking data from a form, and what you can't see on this page is it actually implicitly creates a form for us, and in MVC and as in HTML, you can have multiple forms on one page. So what's actually doing is creating a specific form just for that little edit row and posting back to us, posting it back to the server for us. So in this case, we're going to call it a HTTP post because that's the action that's actually happening. And now we're going to define the public action result and give it the name that we said the thing we'll look for. And here, this is where we pass in. So for sure, we know that we're going to be passing in. It's a table of type category, and I'll simply call it category to reference it. Now, I did skip one little thing in that parameters, and that's the item that binds it for us. So what happens is in here, we want to let it know that we've got a model binder, and it's got a specific type that it's going to be passed in, and this is where the DevExpress editors binder saves you, right? Essentially this, by the way, if you haven't added it, I just added it hitting a control space using DevExpress Web MVC. That's where this lives. And so now essentially this allows us to say, yes, I'm passing in this type, but all of the editors items that are getting passed in called category ID and so forth from those forms, this editor's binder helps us take care of that. And so now we can simply just check to see if our model state is valid. Now this is a MVC method that's provided to us that allows us to check that if you've added model validation, and if it passes it, then we're simply going to try and update it. And in this case, I'm going to do a try. Well, I'll use the try catch, and here we'll call something like update categories or something, and then if we have an exception, we should catch it. So in this case, what we're going to do is, if there's an error, we're going to update the view data and display the error. Now the item that we'll set it to is e.message. Now I know there's some questions, Amanda. I'm almost done, and we'll absolutely get to the questions. Let's just wrap this up a little bit. And so if the model state is not valid, then obviously we don't want to save the data. We just want to let the user know that, hey, and we'll use the view data again to they need to fix their errors. And in that case, we'll simply pass in our own message that says, please correct all errors, and that'll let the users know that there's something they need to do. And because this is an action result, what I need to do is return a view. So in this case, we'd have to do a return partial view, and this is of course going to be similar to what we did earlier here. So okay, by the way, I do a lot of cutting and pasting, so you'll have to forgive me, but I just realized that there's a key problem here. One of the first thing is, when you're passing in the view, here index absolutely makes sense. Here, index doesn't make sense, because this is the view that I'm trying to pass here is the editing partial and not the index. And so here, it's the same thing. We're not going to use the editing partial update because that view doesn't exist. In this case, I actually want to stay within the editing partial. So this partial view that gets returned, it says, okay, I'm going to do a post, but the view that I send back is this default view, which gets the data after it's been updated. So in this case, we actually haven't updated it, but we can simply use our Northwind data provider. Oops. Northwind data provider dot update, and let's see if there's a edit categories, update categories. So there isn't an update categories. We can define one, but essentially what that'll do is update the category. So I will leave that to you guys. If you'd like to see, I can define it, but in essence, you can see that that's where it gets wired up to your model. So now let's take a look at this in action. And oh, okay. So by the way, I see there is a question from somebody named David about the things. Oh, it's important to close off our type-ups there. Oops, and I forgot another one. So give me 1 second. Let me fix this. 1, 2, 1. I'm missing one in here. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at this in action. And now what we'll have is, once we click edit, we can update some values, and if I had defined some model parameters there, then it would catch those. So now when I click update, it didn't actually update the data, because as you notice, I didn't actually save it back out, but you've got it wired up. So this gives you that form. Now I want to show you one last important bit, which is there's a couple things, and there is a blog post. So Google is a good friend of mine because it helps me find all these inline pop-up. There's a recent post that I did that explains it, and there's one setting that you can use to actually change it out, because a lot of people say, hey, you don't actually have inline there. So if you go to settings, that editing mode, you can choose a grid view editing mode. So let's do that. Here, let me just grab the grid line here so that we can save you some trouble. And if we go back to our editing partial, and here, right now, it's set to edit form and display row. But you can set it to inline, or you can set it to pop up. So let's set it to inline, and take a quick look at this in action. And now when we click edit, we've got an inline version, or if you want, let's change this to pop-up edit form, save this, and I should be able to just refresh this. And now when I click edit, I've got a pop-up form as well. So you may want to define the specific pop-up form. Now, I did promise to mention that there are templates available as well. If you take a look at the inline editing templates example, and if you'd like me to go a little bit deeper into the sort of the templated version of this, I'm happy to do, because we can spend a whole another hour on templates, because templates are fantastic. There's probably a couple of things. You know what? I'll probably do a future webinar on templates now that I think about it, because there's a lot more I want to say about templates. But in essence, to define a template is pretty straightforward. You just pick the template that you want. You'll click Settings, and then you say Set Edit Form Template Content. And here, this allows you some free form to get at how it's defined. So you can define a label, etc., etc. And you can also, as you can see, define using the View Context Writer method specific HTML in between. So if you want to wrap it in divs and so forth, or specific CSS lines, we can do that as well. So, you know, I know I'm running just a little bit long, so I'll stop here. And if there's any questions, Amanda.
Yes, Mehul. From Christy, are there attributes containing custom criterias?
You know, yeah, well, see, it is .NET, first of all, right? And yes, you can do that, but Christy, you know, you have to ask, like, where, okay, so say, for example, let's go down here to this is a good example here, right? Can I define my own custom attributes? Yeah, .NET allows that, but who's going to read that, right? So, for example, it depends on your consumer, right? So if you have a specific consumer that says, this is the attribute I'm looking for, yes, absolutely. For us, in MVC, there's only certain things that the framework is going to define for us to look. So what we do in the grid is we're going to take a look at the obvious ones like required, string length, and so forth, right? So if you've got one that says, you know, Christie's range attribute that, you know, et cetera, well, there's no way we can look for that, right? I mean, you can define it, but it depends on your consumer, right? So if you've got a custom consumer class, maybe you're doing this through a web service, and you've got a custom consumer on the other end that says, if it has this attribute, right? The interface for .NET, it says, is this attribute even there? Is this its type of class? So it goes in a little bit into contracts and so forth. You know, there's base things that the framework gives you, and if you absolutely have to define it, then yes. But in general, I would say our grid, it's not going to know, right? It's not going to be able to. It can't assume that, because there's just no way, right? Because it's a free form attribute. You can define any kind of attribute you want, right? So now, if you wanted to extend our grid and so forth so that it looks for your custom attributes, that's a different story, and that's probably quite possible. It's just that you'll be getting into sort of maintaining the grid view at that point yourself, right? And that can be a lot of issues. Now, is there other questions?
Okay. Yes, from David. When will an MVC schedule control be available? Any timeline?
Yes, David. We've talked a little bit about this. Right now, it won't be in 11.2. I would like to, every year in December, we get together with all the team leads and everything. So I'm going to get together with my ASP.NET team and discuss what the possibility is. In MVC, we try not to bring in some of the bigger controls, because the MVC paradigm doesn't really allow, well, obviously, as you know, there's no view state, and then there's, you know, some issues with callbacks and so forth. So not necessarily issues, but just different approaches we have to take. So we try to bring in items that we know will fit very easily, that can be a native extension. And right now, our initial thought with the scheduler is that it would take quite a bit of work, and maybe you having to jump through hoops just to make it work. So, you know, if there isn't a good way to fit it into the framework, if there's an easy way for you to use it, we're not sure if necessarily be a really great benefit. So for sure, it's something I will discuss it with the team, because I don't disagree with you. I want it. In fact, let me show you guys, since you guys hung around so long, I'm going to show you something special. This is going, and there will be a webinar on 11.2 specific stuff, but for MVC, we've got something cool coming out, and that is, actually, you know what? This may be broken, so you may have to forgive me. I think the MVC one is okay though. So this is a preview of, like, I'm sorry, a pre-beta version of what you eventually see. So let's not count on it completely, but this is the big news. Pivot Grid is coming to MVC. Now, if you have not used it, if you have not seen Pivot Grid, go watch the videos. This is a phenomenal control extension, actually. So what this allows you to do, it tells your end users a story better than Grid, because Grid is two-dimensional, and Grid is fantastic, no doubt about it. But if you've got a way, if you want to let your end users know that, hey, in the fourth quarter, what was the total amount of items for a specific product sold by customer, you can do that. And you just can't do that. I mean, this thing is fantastic, and this will, of course, support all of our, beautiful themes. And so we will have more news about this. But the full capabilities with exporting, with all the different summaries, the capabilities to do filter, as so for example, you say, I don't want to see every year. I just want to see 1996. And even then, I don't want it to be summarized. I just want 1996. Look at that. I can collapse that on the fly. It updates it. So I'm super excited, and I'm really excited to see how, especially in MVC, if you'll be using this. So thanks for sticking around, and this is just one of the things that we're doing for MVC, and I'll have more news about other items in the future. Any other questions?
Cool. Thanks, Mehul. That's all the questions.
Awesome. With that, thank you very much, Amanda. I'll give it back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Mehul. All right, everybody. We have a whole lineup of webinars that are currently posted throughout October. We have amazing guest presenters coming up, and of course, our DevExpress product training. Check out all our webinars at devexpress.com/webinars. A quick peek into next week, Monday, September 26th, WinForms Charting Interactive Legends. Learn how you can take advantage of your chart legends to provide additional interactivity for your end users. In this webinar, we're going to use the legend in combination with checkboxes to take our chart interactivity to a new level. And then Wednesday, September 28th, Mehul is back with ASP.NET MVC GridView, how to set up multi-row and instant updates. There it is right there on the screen. Learn how to set up multi-row editing of the DevExpress MVC GridView extension with instant updates, saving using jQuery Ajax. And then Thursday, September 29th, Chris G. Williams is back with his Windows Phone 7 series, digging into isolated storage for Windows Phone. This webinar covers the 3 types of isolated storage available for Windows Phone: storage settings, storage file, and data context. So that's just a little peek as to what's coming next week. All right, everybody, so if you missed anything from this webinar or you want to review any of our previous webinars, please visit us on the DevExpress channel at tv.devexpress.com. And again, thanks so much to Mehul. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks for choosing DevExpress.